You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the second test between Australia and South Africa from the MCG. It's the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast, and let's get started. Let's have a look at the match summary from the second test between Australia and South Africa from the MCG. South Africa batted first and made 189 all out in their first innings. Jansen top scored with 59 and Green took 5 wickets for Australia. Australia in their first innings made 8 for 575 declared. Warner top scored with 200 and Nortje took 3 wickets for South Africa. South Africa in their second innings were bowled out for 204. Bavuma top scored with 65 and Lyon took 3 wickets for Australia. Australia won by an innings and 182 runs and David Warner was named player of the match. What were the key moments and key factors from this second test between Australia and South Africa? Australia winning the toss and bowling first, bowling South Africa out for 189 in the first innings. Australia's batting to score 8 for 575 declared to gain a first innings lead of 386 runs, which put Australia into a strong position in the test match. Australia's bowling to dismiss South Africa for 204 in their second innings, which saw Australia to victory by an innings and 182 runs and claim a 2-0 series lead. Those were the key moments and key factors from this second test at the MCG. Let's have a look at both teams' performances in this second test at the MCG with both bat and ball. We'll start with Australia and their batters. Warner 200, Khawaja 1, Labuschagne 14, Smith 85, Head 51, Green 51 not out, and Carey 111. That's how the Australian batters went about things in this second test with the bat against South Africa at the MCG. Australia's batting in this test match was dominant, and it was a dominant display from Australia with the bat in this second test of the MCG. It was reflective in the score they amassed. 8 for 575 declared at 145 overs was a pretty dominant batting performance. They grinded the South African bowlers to the ground on day 2 in hot and extreme conditions, and they were able to capitalise that on a pretty placid flat surface at the MCG. Now, let's talk about their first innings batting performance, because they only batted once in this test match, Australia, because they won by an innings, obviously. They scored 8 for 575 declared and 145 overs, as I mentioned before. It was a good batting performance, a very dominant batting performance. Needed to bat long to amass a big first innings lead, which they did, Australia. 386 runs in the first innings, so that was a pretty good first innings lead for them, and pretty much set them up in this test match to win by an innings. Australia lost a few quick wickets on day 3. Starting on day 3, Australia were 3 for 386 with a lead of 197 runs, but they lost a few quick wickets in that morning session. Travis Head and Alex Carey were the overnight batters, and they were looking to add a big partnership for Australia, but all of a sudden Australia lost quick wickets. Travis Head got bowled for 51, and then David Warner got bowled for 200 in consecutive deliveries to Nortje. He was bowling pretty rapid and fast. Australia was still in a good position, but wanted to gain a bigger lead to really assert their dominance in this test match. But Alex Carey and Cameron Green, their partnership helped Australia in that tricky position. Adding 112 for the 8th wicket, Carey scored his first century in Test cricket, and Green scored a 50 and battled hard with a broken finger, and it was able to support Alex Carey to his maiden Test century, and that partnership that Carey and Green added together of 112 for the 8th wicket pretty much put Australia in a strong position to get that lead of 386 runs and pretty much set up Australia to win this Test match. So that partnership between Carey and Green and the partnership of 239 for the 3rd wicket between David Warner and Steve Smith early on in the innings were the key partnerships to get Australia to that big first innings lead, as I mentioned. And the Australian batters cashed in on a flat surface at the MCG and made the most of their opportunities, unlike their South African counterparts. So that's pretty much how Australia went about things in this test match with the bat in the first innings. Let's talk about some batters, some key batters, and how they performed in this test match. Let's talk about David Warner first of all. 200, David Warner, of 255 balls. A true test match innings. Cramping up in the hot conditions, but he battled through that, retired hurt, came back on day 4, but he got bowled. First ball by Unrek Norkia for 200, which is a bit of a weird feeling. You retire hurt on 200, you come back to resume your innings, get bowled first ball for 200. It's a bit of a weird feeling. But for David Warner, it was a brilliant innings from him. And I think it was sort of a redeeming sort of innings for David Warner. I think sort of a redemption sort of type innings. Now, I know David Warner didn't celebrate like that. Sort of, he didn't celebrate in terms of, showing his critics that they were wrong and he was right. It wasn't sort of that celebration that he sort of celebrated with, but I sort of really put it as a redeeming innings, really. Sort of a redemption innings after what's happened, all the build-up, all the media stuff, the leadership ban and his involvement in Cape Town and all that. I think for David Warner, this is sort of a closing of the chapter, really, against South Africa in terms of that sort of part of his life where, yes, he was in the wrong and he made a mistake and he paid dearly for it, being suspended for a year and obviously copying a leadership ban as well. But to me, I think it was sort of a redeeming innings, sort of a closing of the chapter. And you could see that the relief on his face when he scored the century was superb. A lot of pressure coming into this test match, but I thought he handled it well. And the way he batted was the David Warner of old. Looking to take the game on, being aggressive, not taking a backward step. And I could really sense that from David Warner. When Australia started their first innings, you saw David Warner take the first ball. And he didn't leave it to Usman Khawaja to take the first ball. Now, in that situation, with him under pressure, after what happened at the Gabba when he got out first ball in the first innings to Rabada on a short ball, you would think it would be understandable that David Warner would not take the first ball of the innings. But he didn't shy away from the challenge. He took on the first ball of the innings. He took strike. And that was a real indication to me that David Warner, he's going to take on this challenge and something's going to happen. Something special is going to happen. Obviously, it was his 100th test match. Obviously, to play 100 test matches for Australia is a big occasion. Not many Australian players do that. Not many players in test cricket do that either. But for him to score a 200 in his 100th test is quite remarkable and quite special. And I think now for David Warner, the pressure's off. Hopefully for him, he can score runs in the next test in Sydney and beyond. Hopefully in the tour of India as well, when Australia go there in February. But yeah, he batted extremely well. And he also crossed over 8,000 test runs for Australia as well in this innings, which is a proud moment in itself as well. As I mentioned, 100th test to score 100 was special. Joins Ricky Ponting in scoring a 100 in their 100th test for Australia. He also becomes the 10th player in test cricket history to score a century in their 100th test. Some brilliant names on that list: Colin Cowdrey, Javed Mandad, Alex Stewart, Inzamam Ul Haq, Ricky Ponting, Graham Smith, Hashim Amla and Joe Root. So he's in good company there, David Warner. So David Warner, for me, by far the standout batter for Australia in this test match. Was a pretty good knock. Good to see David score some runs. He's been dealing with a lot of scrutiny, a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism being placed on him. But I thought he handled it well, and I thought he batted extremely well. And he really set up Australia in this test match. And without his innings, Australia would have been in some trouble. But with his innings of 200, really set up the test match for Australia to get a big first innings lead and to really, dominate South Africa, which Australia did. Steve Smith batted well for his 85. Battled some illness, Steve Smith. Wasn't at his fluent best with the bat. He had a very interesting battle with Marco Janssen. It was a very good battle between bat and ball there. He got through that, got 85. He got a good partnership with Smith, as we mentioned before. Smith got a very handy partnership with David Warner of 239 runs, which was for the third wicket. And that was a crucial wicket partnership for Australia to try and set them up in this test match. So he batted well. Alex Carey, I thought he batted well, deserved his century, batted well for his maiden test century. Boxing Day century is the dream for any Australian Test player. The second wicketkeeper since the late great Ron Marsh to score a century at the MCG as a wicketkeeper. As you saw with Alex Carey, throughout his innings, you could see his confidence grow and grow and grow. Every shot he played, he looked better and better. So good to see Alex Carey. Good partnership with Cameron Green, as we mentioned earlier. He was surprised that Cameron Green came out to bat with him. But I think Cameron Green, to support Carey to get to his century was a good thing to do as a teammate. And I think Alex Carey will be forever grateful for that. But for Alex Carey, let's hope this is the first of many centuries for him in his Test career. And it's good to see him score a century. And hopefully for him, this innings will be a breakout innings for Alex Carey to show that, you know what, I've got what it takes to score big runs in a Test match and hopefully many more in his career. Cameron Green was superb. A gritty, tough knock from Cameron Green. He was battling through the pain with a broken finger. He scored a well-earned 51 not out, supported Carey nicely to his century, and also batted well in that partnership with him, as I mentioned earlier. So for Cameron Green, good to see him tough it out and really support Carey when Carey needed the support the most to get him to his maiden Test century. And last but not least, Travis Head batted well for his 51 off 55 balls. He just keeps growing in confidence with every innings he plays for Australia this summer, Travis Head. And it's good to see Travis Head doing well and performing well. A dominant display from the Australian batters, cashing in on a pretty good batting surface at the MCG. David Warner was the standout Australian batter. A wonderful innings, scoring 200 in his 100th Test for Australia. An innings that was much needed as Warner was under extreme pressure heading into this Test match. It was also good to see Alex Carey score his maiden Test century and hopefully many more for him into the future. So the Australian batters will be pleased with how they performed in this second Test. Let's have a look at the Australian bowlers and their performance in this second Test at the MCG against South Africa. A wicket for Smith, a wicket for Cummins, 4 wickets for Lyon, 3 wickets for Stark, and 3 wickets for Boland. That's how the Australian bowlers went about things in this second Test with the ball against South Africa at the MCG. Yet again, a top-class bowling performance from a quality bowling attack, and Australia absolutely dominated with the ball from the first innings to the second innings of this Test match, bowling South Africa out for low scores to really assert their dominance in this series with the ball. Let's talk about the first innings bowling performance. Winning the toss and bowling first on a good batting pitch at the MCG raised some eyebrows amongst some people, but they bowled South Africa out for 189 inside 68.4 overs Australia. That justified that decision made by Pat Cummins to bowl first. The second innings bowling performance was pretty good with a big first innings lead of 386 runs. Australia's bowlers had South Africa's batters under extreme pressure, but the bowling attack was slightly depleted. They were a bowler down in Cameron Green breaking his finger after copying a nasty blow off Anrik Nortje while batting. Also, Stark was uncertain if he was able to bowl in the second innings after he sustained a broken finger while attempting to catch in the first innings. But Stark was able to bowl and he took a wicket and he contributed to the bowling effort for Australia. And Australia were able, despite the setbacks, despite Green and Stark sustaining finger injuries, they were able to bowl South Africa out for 204 inside 68.5 overs to win the Test match and to win the series with 1 Test to play. So, as I mentioned, pretty good bowling performance for Australia in both innings of this Test match. As we associate with this Australian attack, they just do the basics well with the ball. They bowled good lines and lengths. They applied the pressure onto the South African batters throughout the 2 innings. They bowled dot balls to build pressure. They took wickets at regular intervals. They bowled dot balls and maidens to build pressure. They executed their plans and skills with the ball. They bowled consistent line and length. All the Australian bowlers did their job, and all of them contributed in some way. The fielding was good from Australia. We saw 3 run-outs in this Test match by Australia. Marnus Labuschagne, Travis Head and Mitchell Stark. So that was good to see. Cameron Green was impressive, taking his first ever 5-wicket haul in Test cricket. He bowled extremely well in the first innings and deserved that 5-wicket haul. Hopefully many more to come for Cameron Green. Mitchell Stark, he had to bowl through the pain. He had a broken finger. Didn't really want to let the team down, being 2 bowlers down. in the second innings because that was going to be the problem for Australia. With Green and Stark sustaining injuries to their fingers, Australia were 2 bowlers down in their attack, so that was going to be hard for Australia to take 10 wickets and win this test match. But Mitchell Stark battled through that pain. He was able to take a wicket. He was bowling pretty well. He bowled good pace. He was swinging the ball. He got a wicket and he was able to contribute despite the pain. So it was good to see that from Stark. And just a good all-round effort from Australia, really. It was a dominant display once again with the ball for Australia. It was another dominant display from Australia's bowlers in the second test. The South African batters had no answers to combat the Australian bowlers. All the bowlers did their job and took wickets. The attack was slightly depleted in the second innings after Green and Stark sustained injuries, but Australia still managed to get the job done and take the 20 wickets to win the test match. Let's have a look at South Africa's team performance with both bat and ball in this second test at the MCG. We'll start with their batters. Elgar, 26-0. Irvi, 18-21. De Bruyn, 12-28. Bavuma, 1-65. Zondo, 5-1. Verreynne, 52-33. And Janssen, 59-5. That's how the South African batters went about their business in this second test of the series at the MCG against Australia. Well, yet again, South Africa's batting struggled again in this second test at the MCG. As we saw in the first test at the Gabba, they struggled there on a pretty spicy surface, but on a pretty placid, flat surface at the MCG, their batters struggled in both innings. Getting bowled out for 189 and 204 reflected how South Africa have batted in this series thus far. Didn't make the most of their opportunity given to them by Australia after Australia decided to bowl first. It was an opportunity for South Africa to make big runs. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. Let's talk about the first innings. They were bowled out for 189 inside 68.4 overs. Wasn't a good performance by South Africa. Lacked any big partnerships except for the partnership of 112 for the 6 wicket between Verreynne and Janssen. Verreynne and Janssen scored 50s, the only 2 50s in the first innings scored by South Africa. They showed the other South African batters how to bat on this batter-friendly surface at the MCG, but as soon as the top and middle order collapsed and the tail-enders couldn't stay around long enough to score runs, South Africa's innings was doomed, and they were bowled out for 189. It wasn't a 189 all-out surface. There were no gremlins, there were no demons in the surface. It was pretty good for batting. After what happened at the Gabba, the MCG wicket didn't have enough grass on it, and it was pretty good for shot making. Unfortunately for South Africa, their batters did not capitalise on that. Let's talk about the second innings. The second innings was even worse than the first innings. South Africa were 386 runs behind on the first innings and needed to bat out 2 days for a draw. That was highly unlikely, and they were bowled out for 204 inside 68.5 overs. They couldn't bat out for a draw. The batters struggled with the relentless pressure applied by the Australian bowlers. It was simply too much to handle for the South African batters, and they collapsed in a big way. There was one 50-plus partnership in the second innings for South Africa, and that was the partnership of 63 for the 5th wicket between Bavuma and Verreynne. Showed some good resistance and fight with the bat, but couldn't go on with it. And for South Africa's point of view, they needed to go on and bat for a long period of time. Unfortunately, they weren't able to do that. So that's the summary of how South Africa batted in both of their innings in this test match. It was pretty poor from the get-go, and their batting has been really poor throughout the series. One thing I want to touch on with South Africa's batting is they're not doing the basics well enough. And we saw that in this test match. A couple of basic things to do as a batting group. They didn't do them well. We saw 3 run-outs. Now, one example of not doing the basics well was running between the wickets. There were 3 run-outs in this test match by South Africa. Dean Elgar was run out by Marnus Labuschagne for 26 in the first innings. And in the second innings, we saw Sondo get run out by Travis Head for 1. And then we saw Maharaj get run out for 13 by Mitchell Stark. That's a prime example of South Africa not doing the basics. A bit of confusion, apprehension when running between the wickets. There was no clear running between the wickets. There was no clear calling. There was mix-ups. Batters were confused. It's just basic stuff, really. just summed up their mindset. It just summed up how their batters are going about their business. Not quite doing the basics well enough. Another basic thing to do when batting is backing up at the non-strikers end. And as we saw in this test match, it was pretty well documented that Mitchell Starc had a bit of a fiery exchange with De Bruin, especially in the second innings, about De Bruin backing up. Now, as we saw in the replays and as we saw from the images, as most people would see from this second test, about the exchange that Mitchell Starc had with De Bruin in the second innings, you saw that De Bruin was well out of his crease before Mitchell Starc bowled the ball. Now, that's a basic thing to do, backing up. You know, even South Africa's batters in terms of Zondo, for example, when he got run out by when he got run out by Travis Head in the second innings, he wasn't backing up well enough. He could have made that if he put in a dive or he backed up correctly. As we saw with De Bruin, just being lazy, you know, just not really paying attention to that sort of thing. It's just basic stuff. It just sums up where South Africa are at with their mindset, with their batting group at the moment. They're not with it. They're not doing the basics well enough. And to be quite honest, that probably most of their test batters are probably not up to the level at playing test cricket. It's a different level to playing test cricket compared to first class cricket, and not doing the basics well enough. You know, you got to be doing the key things well. You know, running between the wickets and backing up are basic things, and they just didn't do that well enough in this test match, which is poor on their point of view. Also, lack of desperation from the South African batters as well. We saw when Zondo got run out, he didn't even put in a dive. Yes, he was gone for all money, but at least show some desperation and dive. You know, be committed, and you want to put in an effort to make your ground. They didn't do that. So South Africa, their batters just lacking those areas of their game. They need to improve on that going forward. There were 3 South African batters who really batted well in this test for South Africa, and that was Vreni, Janssen, and Bavuma. 3 of them scored 50s in this test match, and throughout the whole series, Vreni, as we saw in the first test in Brisbane, played a very good knock in the first innings where he got a very good 60-odd. Also in the second test here, he got a good 50 in the first innings. He's been the standout South African batter in this series. Janssen batted well in the first innings. He's capable with the bat. He's more of a bowling all-rounder than a batting all-rounder, but he's got some talent there with the bat. I believe he was a former opening batter back in his younger days when he was starting to play the game. So you can see that he's got a bit of technique about him with the bat. It was good for him to score that half century in Test cricket, his first one, but also to score that partnership with Vreni, over 100 runs in the first innings to really get South Africa to some sort of total. In the end, they got bowled out for 189, but it was something. And Bavuma, in the second innings, scoring 65. He's been under some pressure based on his form and conversion rates in Test cricket, but he was able to dig in and show a bit of fight. He faced over 144 balls for 65 runs. That shows some good fight and resistance that he applied. So those 3 were the only real positives from South Africa's batting throughout this test match. The rest of them, as we've seen throughout this series thus far, have been poor, and they've got some work to do to rectify that. South Africa's batters struggled yet again, and quite simply, some of their batters may not be up to test match standard. That showed during this second test of the series. Let's have a look at South Africa's bowlers and their performance in this second test at the MCG against Australia. A wicket for Janssen, no wickets for Maharaj, 2 wickets for Rabada, 3 wickets for Nortje, and a wicket for Ngidi. That's how the South African bowlers went about things here at the MCG for this second test of the series against Australia. South Africa's bowling in this test match wasn't their best bowling performance. They had a pretty good bowling performance at the Gabba, as we know. They bowled pretty well up there on a pretty bowler-friendly surface. Contrast that to a flat, placid surface here at the MCG. Their bowlers didn't really look at their best, or they weren't really threatening. They were at times, but they didn't do it on a consistent basis. Let's talk about the first innings bowling performance. They only had to bowl once in this test match because Australia didn't bat again for a second time, as Australia won by an innings, obviously. So the first innings bowling performance by South Africa, they got bowled out for 189 in the first innings. That didn't help the bowlers' cause. Defending 189 was always going to be a real struggle. Whenever you get bowled out for less than 200 in a test match, you're always on the back foot. And South Africa from that moment on were behind in this test match from the word go. The bowlers had to toil hard in extreme heat on day 2. It was touching around about 40 degrees. And so that wasn't pleasant for the South African bowlers, but they got on with it. They were able to bowl their overs through that heat, and they were able to pick up some wickets and toil hard through that tough period. They conceded a big first innings lead of 386 runs, and they conceded 8 for 575 declared from Australia, and conceding a lead of 386 runs, as I mentioned before. That just showed pretty much how they bowled in this test match. It wasn't good enough, and they could have done better. They spent over 145 overs in the field, and that's a long time in the field. That's just about over 2 days or something like that. So a very tired bowling attack, and that showed in their performance. I think South Africa didn't do the basics well enough with the ball. They didn't do the basics well, and that showed. They didn't bowl good lines and lengths. They didn't apply pressure onto the Australian batters throughout the innings. They didn't build dot balls to build pressure on the Australian batters. They didn't take wickets at regular intervals. They didn't bowl dot balls or maidens. And that was the biggest problem that South Africa faced in this whole test match. Bowling dot balls and maidens. We'll come back to that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. They didn't execute their plans or skills with the ball. They didn't bowl a consistent line and length. And they didn't bowl in partnerships. And this is where I tie in the point I made before about not bowling enough dot balls or maidens, is because they didn't bowl in partnerships well enough. And this was highlighted by their bowling coach, Chan Langaford. And I was listening to his press conference on day 3, I think it was. He was talking about the bowling performance from South Africa, and he highlighted some issues that South Africa had with their bowling. And one of them was not bowling in partnerships. We talk about bowling partnerships a lot, and we also talk about partnerships with batting. It's important to bat in partnerships. So when you're batting, it's important to make partnerships and build partnerships. With bowling, it's important to bowl in partnerships from both ends. Keep the pressure on from both ends. They didn't do that, South Africa. They didn't bowl enough maidens. Now, South Africa in their innings, when they bowled to Australia in the first innings, they only bowled 8 maidens. And that just highlights they didn't build enough pressure on Australia. Now, Australia, throughout the 2 innings that Australia bowled in this test match, in the first innings, Australia bowled 14 maidens, and in the second innings, they bowled 15. So that highlights that Australia were bowling well in partnerships, and we've seen that for Australia throughout the series and throughout many years with this bowling attack that Australia have. They bowl well in partnerships. Unlike South Africa, didn't bowl well in partnerships, didn't build pressure, and they weren't able to keep Australia down with the ball, which is a concern for them going forward. So they didn't quite do the basics well enough, South Africa, didn't quite look at their threatening best. Kahisa Rabada was poor. The problem with Kahisa Rabada in this test match is that every time he bowled a new over, he didn't start the over well enough. He didn't build any pressure at all. He looked off, didn't look at his best. We know Kahisa Rabada is a very good bowler, but in this test match, he looked really off it, to be honest. The only bowler who was pretty good from South Africa's point of view was Anrich Nortje, someone who kept steaming in, bowling quick pace, 150 plus. David Warner said the spell that he faced to Nortje, he said that was probably one of the quickest spells I've ever faced in Test cricket in my time of playing 100 Test matches. That's probably the fastest spell I've ever faced from a bowler. And he was the only one who kept steaming in on a 40-degree day on day 3. He kept steaming in, he kept bowling his heart out, and he took wickets when needed. And he bowled without luck at times, but then he was able to cash in and take wickets. He got 3 wickets in the end. He got 2 wickets and 2 balls when he got rid of Travis Head and David Warner for 200. So I thought he was the pick of the bowlers. Marco Jansen, I thought he was pretty good. And then he dropped away a little bit. but I thought he bowled well to Steve Smith. There was a really intriguing battle between him and Steve Smith. He had Steve Smith on toast. Steve Smith was in all sorts when Marco Janssen was getting the ball to swing and doing all sorts of things. He was good at times throughout the innings. The rest of the bowlers, Maharaj and Ngidi, were disappointing. It wasn't their best bowling performance, South Africa. It was a poor bowling performance from South Africa in this second test. The bowlers managed to get through the extreme hot conditions on day 2, but they weren't at their best as a bowling unit. They will need to reflect as a bowling group and look on the areas to improve on heading into Sydney for the third test. Let's preview the third test of the series between Australia and South Africa from the SCG, talk about the potential 11s for both teams and who's going to win this third test. Let's have a look at the test records and stats between Australia and South Africa from the SCG. The first test match played between Australia and South Africa at the SCG was back in 1910. 11 matches have been played in that time. 2 of them have been draws. Australia have won 8 of those 11 matches to South Africa's 1. Let's have a look at Australia's potential 11 for the third test of this series. And Australia will have to make 2 changes. Cameron Green and Mitchell Starc have been ruled out of the third test due to injury. Both Green and Starc picking up finger injuries in the second test at the MCG. So Australia will have to make 2 changes to their 11 for the final test of this series against South Africa. Now, Australia have called up Ashton Agar and Matt Renshaw as replacements for Starc and Green in the squad. And you would think either Ashton Agar or Matt Renshaw will have the opportunity to come into the 11 to replace one of Green and Starc. So let's talk about the first selection conundrum for the Australian selectors, and that's whether or not they want to play 2 spinners or not. Now, they've called up Ashton Agar into the side. Now, Ashton Agar is a left-arm spinner. He has played Test cricket before for Australia. We remember how he went on Test debut in the 2013 Ashes, scoring 90-odd on debut, nearly got a century. He hasn't played a Test match for Australia since 2017, which was in Bangladesh. So it's around about 5 years or so from his last Test. Now, Australia have brought him into the squad because the talk from everyone at the SCG is that the SCG wicket square is quite dry. It may take turn. So both Australia and South Africa may play 2 spinners. That is the talk. Now, if Australia play 2 spinners, then you would think Ashton Agar will come in for Cameron Green and he will be the second spinner to Nathan Lyon. That's if Australia think that they want to play 2 spinners. Now, in reality, I don't think Australia should play 2 spinners because Australia already have spin options in the side. We saw in this recent test match Steve Smith bowl a few overs in the second innings and he got the last wicket of Kahisa Rabada, got him out bowled to win the test match for Australia. He's one spin option. He can bowl his leggies. You've also got Marnus Labuschagne who can bowl leg spin as well. You've got Travis Head who can bowl off spin. So you've got some options there for spinners. So really, for Australia, either Ashton Agar or Matt Renshaw will come in to replace Cameron Green. So it's either going to be Agar or Renshaw to come in to replace Cameron Green. So that's one selection conundrum that Australia have. So it'll be a bit of an interesting selection call whether they go with Agar or Renshaw. Do they want Ashton Agar, an all-rounder, sort of an all-rounder? He's more of a bowling all-rounder than a batter, but he can bat a bit. So do you want him to replace Cameron Green as a sort of like-for-like replacement? Or do you want Matt Renshaw to come in to play as the extra batter at number 6? Or in the middle order, obviously, so he'll come in at 6 to strengthen the batting even more? Because if Ashton Agar's in the side, therefore Kerry will probably have to go up to 6 and bat one place higher than he is at the moment at number 7. But Kerry is better suited at number 7 than number 6 because I think that's a little bit too high for Kerry. So Australia will have to think about that if they want to play 2 spinners or not. Depends on the conditions at the SCG. Depends how dry the surface is and whether or not they want to play Ashton Agar, because you've got to remember Australia tour India next year and they will want to play 2 spinners, so they will want to give Ashton Agar a go. And Australia's already won the series. You would think this is the best time to do that. So it'll be interesting to see if they go with Agar and Renshaw to replace Cameron Green. But it will come down to if they want to play 2 spinners or not. That's the first selection conundrum, as I mentioned. The second one is Mitchell Starc. Now, this one is probably straightforward, I would think. If Josh Hazlewood is fit, then Josh Hazlewood comes in to replace Stark. But there's been talk about Lance Morris, this very quick bowler from the West, from Western Australia. He's a left-armer, so similar to Mitchell Stark, both left-armers. So it comes down to Australia if they want a like-for-like replacement. Mitchell Stark, left-arm quick. Do they want to replace him with Lance Morris, who's also a left-arm quick and bowls quick? And it's a perfect opportunity for Australia to try him out in the last test match of the series, seeing that Australia's already won the series, wrapped up the series. You usually see teams try players and potential debuts for someone. But I still think if Josh Hazlewood's 100% fit, he plays, he gets the nod over Morris. It's just the way it goes in terms of selection, because Hazlewood's the senior player, he's well experienced, and he should be given the opportunity. He hasn't played much test cricket at all this year. So that's a selection conundrum for Australia. Who replaces Mitchell Stark? Either Hazlewood or Morris. So the potential 11 for Australia for the third test could be Warner, Khawaja, Labuschagne, Smith, Head, Ashton Agar or Renshaw, Carey, Cummins, Lyon, Hazlewood or Morris, and Boland. Let's have a look at South Africa's potential 11 for the third test of this series at the SCG against Australia. And I think South Africa will make 2 changes to their 11 for the third test at the SCG. Now, seeing that the SCG may take a bit of turn and some spin, I think South Africa may be tempted to play 2 spinners, just like Australia will be as well. South Africa do have Simon Harmer, who's the other spinner in the squad. So he could potentially partner Maharaj as the spin attack for the 2 spinners here at the SCG, seeing that the SCG wicket square is a lot drier this year. It may take turn, and both teams may be tempted to play 2 spinners. I think probably Harmer may come into the side if South Africa opt to go with 2 spinners. I think he may replace Ngidi. Now, I think he will be probably one of the South African bowlers to miss out for Harmer if South Africa decide to go down the route of the 2 spinners for this test match at the SCG. To me in Melbourne, he looked a little bit off, Ngidi. He looked a bit... he was struggling a bit. Maybe he's carrying an injury or something like that. He wasn't quite at his best. He was cramping up as well. And given that the South African bowlers bowled a lot of overs in Melbourne, over 145 overs in the field, it wouldn't be a bad thing for South Africa to rest Ngidi or rest one of the other bowlers and play the second spinner in Harmer. So I think that could be one potential change they could make to the 11. The other change is probably is definitely a forced change. De Bruyn, who came into this second test at the MCG in place of Rassie van der Dussen, he will be not available for the third test because he's going to go back home to South Africa to be with his wife as they're expecting their first child. So we wish him all the best in that. So he's going to be ruled out of the third test due to that. So that does open a spot for South Africa. So either Rassie van der Dussen, who missed out the second test, or Heinrich Klaasen could come in to replace De Bruyn for the third test match at the SCG. South Africa don't really have enough batting depth in the squad to call upon. So they either have to go back to Van der Dussen, who played the first test, or they try out the wicketkeeper batter in Klaasen to replace De Bruyn for this third test. So those could be the couple of changes that South Africa make for this third test to their 11 of this series. So South Africa's potential 11 for the third test could be Elgar, Irvi, Van der Dussen or Klaasen, Bavuma, Sondo, Vereni, Jansen, Maharaj, Rabada, Nortje, Ngidi or Harmer. Who's going to win this third test at the SCG? Well, the Pink Test or the New Year's Test at Sydney is always a great test match, as we know on the Australian cricket calendar. It's so special in so many ways, but the main focal point of the test match is the McGrath Foundation and what they do to support people with breast cancer and dealing with that. Such a terrible disease, but Glenn McGrath, who set up the foundation, does wonderful work, and it grows every year. Every Pink Test gets bigger and better, and no doubt this Pink Test will be a special one. And obviously Australia and South Africa played the first ever Pink Test, which was back in 2008-09 at the SCG, so it's fitting that South Africa played this Pink Test in 2022-23 against Australia to sort of commemorate the first ever Pink Test, I suppose, that was ever played with the McGrath Foundation. So It's always a special test, the SCG. No doubt this test match will be a good test match this year. As I mentioned, South Africa will play their first test match at the SCG since 2008-9. They lost that test match, and Australia won that test match, but South Africa won the series 2-1. But as I mentioned before, that was the first ever test for the pink test for the McGrath Foundation between these two sides. So as I mentioned, it will be quite a special test match for the McGrath Foundation in terms of that anniversary. Also, I think if people remember that test match, it's where Graham Smith broke his hand. As South Africa were 9 down, there was uncertainty about Graham Smith coming out to bat. But Graham Smith, doing the courageous thing, came out to bat with his broken hand to try and get South Africa to a draw. Unfortunately, he battled through the pain, but he wasn't able to get the draw for South Africa, and Mitchell Johnson clean bowled him, and Australia won the test match, which went down to the wire. Let's hope this test match could live up to that, but given how this series has gone thus far, I don't think that will be the case. Now, the SCG pitch may take turn. There's been talk about the wicket square this summer at the SCG being dry. A few Sheffield Shield matches there have had some pitches that have turned quite a lot. So both teams, as we mentioned with the potential 11s, could be toiling with the idea of playing 2 spinners in their side. So it'll be interesting to see what the teams do there. So both teams, in terms of their batting units, will need to be on their game if the pitch is a bit dry and going to take turn from the get-go. So both teams will have to be wary of that. After winning the last 2 tests in a dominant fashion, I think Australia should be favourites to win this final test and win the series 3-0. As we know with South Africa, their batting has struggled throughout this whole entire series. As we saw in Melbourne, as we saw at the Gabba, they're just not up to it. They just can't cope with Australia's pressure with the ball. So Australia just too good. I think they should be able to win this series quite easily. And there's extra motivation for Australia as well. If Australia win this final test match of the series, they pretty much book their place in the WTC final. So there's plenty to play for Australia. Also for South Africa as well. If they avoid defeat and they try and win the test, they still have a chance of qualifying for the WTC final. But for Australia, if they win this final test, which they should, they'll book their place for the WTC final. And I think Australia should be able to win this series 3-0 and finish off the test summer on a very good winning note. They had a good series against the West Indies. They won that series 2-0. And they'll be looking to win this series 3-0. And as I mentioned, end the Australian test summer on a winning note. What can we expect from both teams and from this third test at the SCG? The Pink Test, or New Year's Test at Sydney, is always the highlight of the Australian cricket summer. But it's also a test match that brings awareness to breast cancer via the McGrath Foundation, a foundation that Glenn McGrath set up after his late wife Jane went through her battle with the disease. The foundation does wonderful work, and the whole SCG turns pink for the duration of the test to show their support. But it turns extra pink on day 3, on Jane McGrath Day. Both Australia and the visiting teams always show tremendous support towards the foundation, and no doubt both Australia and South Africa will show that this year. Australia will be looking to secure a 3-0 series win. If they do win this test, Australia book their spot in the WTC final. So there's extra motivation for the Australian team. South Africa will need to show some fight in this final test of the series and try their best to avoid a 3-0 series defeat. It was a dominant performance by Australia in this second test at the MCG to win by an innings and 182 runs. We saw some true test match cricket performances in this test with both bat and ball. David Warner's 200, batting through extreme heat, battling cramps and under extreme pressure heading into this test match to produce a top-class innings. We also saw Cameron Green scoring a well-earned 50, battling through the pain of a broken finger, and Mitchell Starc bowling with a broken finger in the second innings to do his best not to let the side down. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page, and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe, and bye for now.